everything you need to know about selecting and managing the best system integrator for your digital transformation. We're going to talk about that and many other things here in episode 235 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 235. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. This is the podcast that is tech agnostic and covers everything related to the digital strategy, people, process, and technology aspects of transformation. So thank you for joining us here today. The show is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting. And Third Stage is an independent tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And I'm really excited for today's episode because we're going to dive deep into a topic we haven't covered a lot on this podcast, and that is how to select and manage and just find the right system integrator or technical implementation partner to help you through a digital transformation. There's a lot of system integrators out there. A lot of them are good, and a lot of them leave something to be desired. And of course, this all depends on which technology or technologies you're focused on. Every technical platform out there has their own ecosystem of system integrators and implementation partners. So navigating that landscape can be very challenging. For example, if you look at the Microsoft Dynamics 365 ecosystem, there's hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of value-added resellers, system integrators, technical implementers out there that focus on Microsoft D365. And Microsoft, as an extreme, has taken a more of a hands-off, laissez-faire approach to their ecosystem, and it's pretty easy to become a D365 implementer. Now, having said that, that means that there's a lot of organizations out there that have signed up to become a D365 implementer. Some of them are very good, some of them aren't, and some of them are mixed in between. And that's just one ecosystem. That's just Microsoft. If you look at SAP, if you look at Oracle, if you look at NetSuite, you look at Epicor, Infor, Salesforce, Workday, all the major technology providers have their own ecosystem of providers. Some of them are more dependent on the third-party implementers to do the work. Some of them are more focused on doing the implementations themselves. And when I say they themselves, I mean the vendors. Some of the vendors will do their own implementations depending on the industry, the size, the geography, et cetera. So a lot to consider when you're choosing a system integrator or an implementation partner. And of course, this is just one piece of an overall program. When you're going through a digital transformation, you're essentially trying to find that system integrator that can manage that one work stream within your overall program, that one technical software specific work stream. You also have other work streams you have to worry about too, which are outside the realm of system integrators. You have change management, you have the overall program management, you have the architecture, the data integration, the migration, the decommissioning of legacy systems, all sorts of stuff that has to go into a digital transformation. And of course, if you have multiple systems that you're deploying, that means you're going to have potentially multiple system integrators, multiple resellers that you're going to work with to deploy these different technologies. And you need that overarching program management to manage the entire thing. Now, having said all that, we're going to zoom in, though, on that one piece of the overall program structure, that one piece that's focused on deploying technology. And as much as we talk in this podcast about how implementing the actual technology is the least difficult and the least complex part of a digital transformation, the people and the process sides are typically a lot more complex. And even though that still remains true, it still is important. You still need to find that right system integrator and the right technical implementation partner to make sure that you're setting yourselves up to be successful. And certainly, one of the big blind spots that we see in this whole discussion is companies that don't find the right system integrator, or one that's not a good fit for them, or they defer too much to the system integrator and assume that the system integrator is going to provide the entire program for them, when in fact they're not. They're only going to provide one work stream. And then a third challenge that we see very commonly, especially with larger organizations and the larger consulting firms that specialize in technical implementations, you see this dynamic where the system integrator will take complete control of the project. They will oftentimes make decisions for you around how you run your business. They will deploy the technology the way they think is best, which may or may not be best for you, the organization. So that's another thing to manage or to think about too, is that it's not just about finding the right technology or finding the right system integrator. It's also about how you manage them, putting the governance and the guardrails in place so that you're managing them and they're not managing you. So that's really the theme of today's conversation. We're going to have two guests on the show here today that will unpack this topic in more detail. First, we'll have Bonnie Tinder on the show. She's the CEO and founder of Raven Intel. She'll be on chatting with us about how to, not just how to find the right system integrator, but she's going to talk about some of the data that she's been compiling with her tool and her company, specific data and trends and patterns related to system integrators and implementation partners. So she'll share with us some of the things that we need to be thinking about and knowing about system integrators, some of the criteria we should be thinking about. And then later in the show, we will also have Clifford Martin on the show. And Clifford is our VP of Third Stage Consulting in Africa. And one of the things he's passionate about is selecting and managing the right system integrator. And so we're going to have him on the show to talk about that. So this whole episode is dedicated to this whole thread of how to select and manage the right system integrator for your organization. So with that all being said, let's turn to Bonnie Tinder, who, again, she's the CEO of Raven Intel. Raven Intel is a sort of a Yelp or a peer review site that will allow organizations to provide ratings, objective ratings of the system integrator or partner that they've worked with in their digital transformation. So she started the company right around the time I started Third Stage. So she and I have shared battle scars and compared notes on how to grow successful companies. And she's been someone I've tracked very closely with over the years. And she's been on this podcast before. I'm excited to have her on again. So with all that being said, Bonnie, thanks for being here today.
Eric, thank you so much for having me. It's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, I always love having you on the show because this is literally the only conversation I have on the podcast or even just day-to-day industry discussions with someone who has real data to back qualitative observations and things that I think a lot of us may see and feel in the space, but you've actually got some data to back all this. And that's what I'm really excited to dive into here today, because it's been a while since you've been on the podcast, and I'd love to hear what trends we're seeing and what some of the updates are. But before we get into some of the questions that I've got for you and the audience has for you, I'd love to hear from you. You know, and you started the company in 2018, right?
Yep.
And one thing I remember when you started it, because we knew each other at the time, or right around the time you started the company, I remember thinking, why has no one ever done this before? And why is this such a novel idea in this space? You know, you have Yelp, you have Google reviews, you have all these things in the consumer space that you can use to see what your peers are rating certain services or restaurants or bars or whatever. But in the enterprise tech space, it was something that was really lacking. So what led you down this path of starting Raven Intel? And maybe tell us a little bit about what Raven Intel is too, while you're at it, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, Eric, it's a great parallel that you bring between what we do in a Yelp or TripAdvisor. So the essence of our business is all around voice of customer. And we get the real feedback from the customers who are actually going through these implementations. And where I really saw a need in the marketplace was not even so much with the software. I mean, when I had started the company 8 years ago, there was G2 Crowd, there was Gartner Peer Insights, Capterra. I mean, they're a dime a dozen. There's so many software review sites out there. But what was really lacking and what nobody was looking at was the implementation and the partners that were responsible for it. So despite all of these review sites where you can see, what users are saying about the usability of the software, there was no place to look to say, well, what's the experience of the team that's implementing this stuff? Were they able to get it live? All, these other firms are looking at, and I consider them peers because they're looking at software features and functions, and all of that is really important. But the lens that we look at is, what was the effort to get this project live? and the consulting partner who is helping you through that. And as you mentioned at the top of this broadcast, not all partners are created equal. And all the good software in the world does not matter a lick if you do not have the right partner helping and guiding you in the the transformation project. So that's really the need that I saw. That's what we built since 2018. Right now we have over 4,000 reviews of these projects, right? These are not small projects. These are transformation projects of everything from SAP to Oracle, Workday, and other major HCM systems. So UKG, Dayforce, et cetera. And, again, the lens that we look at and everything that we care about is voice of customer as it relates to the transformation success and the implementation of the software. So that's what makes us unique. That's why I started the company. And excited to talk about some of what we're hearing.
And it's important to note too, and just to clarify for the audience here, that these aren't, this isn't sort of an open, it is an open review site, but I can't go on there as a system integrator. I can't go on there and self-assess myself. It's a vetted, you guys vet out and confirm and validate that it's an actual end customer that's writing the reviews, right?
1,000,000%. And we vet that it's not an AI generated review either. And that's where I think some of our other peers have really, with the volume that they're handling, oh my goodness, I can't imagine how they have to, parse out the bot created reviews. Cause that's a real concern in our industry.
Yeah.
Every single one of our 4,000 reviews. And I mean, every single one of them, we have the email address, the business email address of who wrote it. We are looking up their LinkedIn profile and we are verifying back at that business address that what they said is valid. So every single one of the reviews that we have on our site, we stand behind and we know it was written by a human and a human who knew about that project. It's a huge, important differentiation point, but we have only 4,000 reviews. I mean, I think that's definitely a great sample set. On the other hand, we don't have 1 million that, sort of gets unwieldy and you're almost incapable of verifying the legitimacy of those. So it's something we take very important. Our business is all about trust.
Right. Now, before I jump in and start asking you about some of the trends you're seeing in the data as of late, I want to turn to the audience here real quickly and ask the audience a question here. This is not at all scientific. This is just a informal survey I wanted to get going here with in the chats. But I'd love to hear what your general experience has been with systems integrators. For those of you that have hired or worked with a system integrator in the past, is it A, great, B, terrible, or C, somewhere in between or mixed? And I know that's might be hard to answer that and as a broad generalization. It probably depends on which system integrator you're referring to. If you've worked with multiple, but love to hear your thoughts in the chat. So just drop that in the chat, A, B, or C on what your experience has been. And I also want to say hello to a few people in the audience before we get too far into this. Sam Graham joining from Spain, who I continue to be envious of in his semi-retirement living in Spain. Darian on LinkedIn says, good morning. Good morning, Darian. Demetrio says the right software pales in comparison to the right partner to drive the change and adoption work needed. It's very consistent with what you just said, Bonnie. Yep. And oftentimes technology is the least of your worries, when you're going through a project like this. So finding that right implementation partner, that right, that right person that not only understands the technology, but it can also bridge the gap between your business and what the software can do. Hello to Brian on YouTube joining from Dublin, Ireland. And then Sam Graham says they're very good at billing hours. So you didn't answer the question though, Sam. Is that A, B, or C on the survey? But you're right; they are very good at billing hours, and that's a point. Even though I think you might be saying that a bit tongue in cheek, Sam, that is a good point in that. Oftentimes, when you go through these projects, it's usually the system integrator is the only one that's ensured profitability and success. The implementing organization is not necessarily, and if there's any overruns or the risks of the project primarily fall on the end customer. So that's why it's so important to make sure you find that right partner. So I'll leave the question up here for a moment. Love to hear your thoughts on A, B, or C on your responses here. But Bonnie, just to get started, what are some of the biggest shifts you've seen in the system integrator space over the last 12 to 18 months. The last time you and I spoke about this, the world has changed quite a bit, with wars and AI, and the tech space is being disrupted in many ways. I mean, what are you seeing any patterns in the data or things that are emerging recently?
Yeah. Well, I think there is the ability to, create a higher velocity for projects because you are able through AI tools to handle things like documentation, and system requirements a lot faster. Fast doesn't necessarily equate to quality, but I think as more and more of these tools are being used within the project, it's helping to create faster communication and better documentation. Whereas things in the past, it was so difficult to get your scribe to, and or your historian to document a project. Now with some of the AI tools, that has become a lot better. So that's a step in the right direction. I think it's also easier for firms to onboard new staff, and probably, provide a better aggregate set of onboarding materials for newer staff. What does that mean? That means that I think SIs are hiring or have the ability to hire younger people who can get up to speed faster. Does that mean that they're adding more people to their team as a result of some of these? I don't think that we're seeing that. And it's not like there's now tons of opportunity for young, unskilled workers within this group. However, it is faster to train and onboard employees or consultants based upon, using some of the tools, and the agents, et cetera, for training. So I would say that's a step in the right direction. Have we seen the cost of implementations decrease as a result of this? I haven't seen any evidence of that yet in our data. I think the cost of implementations continues to be, pretty high. However, I think more and more as these implementations become faster and can be run with fewer SI resources, that we should see the costs go down in the future. So those are some of the major things.
So too early to tell if AI is materially going to impact the SI costs. I mean, we can hypothesize that it probably will, but you haven't yet seen it in the data.
I have not seen customers remark how AI has made that material impact on the return on investment or the time or the speed to live. I'm sorry, we've seen the speed to live go up, but we haven't seen the cost to go live come down like that. I think in the future, though, that's going to change. And my prediction is that AI native delivery is going to potentially cut implementation time by 25 to 30%, probably within the next year or so.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point, and something that I think is going to be a really interesting dynamic, because now you've got sort of a conflicting incentive here for system integrators. It's if you introduce AI, back to Sam Graham's point a moment ago, they're not able to bill hours as much as they did before. And that's a real dilemma, I think, especially for these bigger consulting firms that are so dependent on tons of billable hours and tons of junior resources that are doing a lot of the grunt work that AI can do for you now.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to share, shameless self-promotion here. Third Stage has an AI tool that we use during our implementation projects and our selection projects with clients. It's called Mission Control AI. If you scan the QR code right here, you can learn more about it. But it's a tech agnostic tool that we use during any sort of enterprise technology implementation to capture a lot of that tribal knowledge that you're talking about, Bonnie. And it's also a way for clients to take control back from the system integrators that oftentimes are taking too much ownership of the project, and the companies themselves aren't taking as much ownership. That AI tool set is not only making things faster and cheaper for our clients, but it's also a way for clients to make sure that they have all their tribal knowledge documented in one place, and that they have access to all the information in the project and can be more efficient in the process. So I'll leave that up for a second. If you'd like to learn more, it's a really cool tool that we've developed with our partners at Octor. I want to get to a couple audience points and questions here. Luke on LinkedIn says phase 0 is the most important phase of a project, which totally agree with you on that. And phase 0 typically would include finding that right system integrator or those right technical resources to support your project. Sam Graham has another follow-up comment here on LinkedIn. Good people can make a bad system work, but bad people can't deliver good systems. Very well said. And I think that's really the theme of a lot of what your data shows too, Bonnie, is you could be implementing the perfect technology, the right fit for your organization, but if you've got the wrong partner, it almost doesn't matter that you found that right technology because you can't figure out how to use it or you haven't been able to deploy it effectively. Someone on LinkedIn says...
To add on to that point too, what we've seen is the selection process is so single-threaded to finding the software and not necessarily on creating a good project plan and getting the right partner lined up, that by the time that they select the software based on, the multiple RFPs and choices and vendors that they have in, it's like implementation is the afterthought. Whereas, in my mind, you need to do a 50-50 split, spend as long considering the implementation process and project that you have in place and your partner as you do selecting the software. Because like Sam said, all the good software in the world is meaningless if you have a bad implementation.
Yeah. Very well said. Here's an interesting comment on LinkedIn that I want to get your insights on, Bonnie, in terms of if you have data that supports this thought. But I apologize, I don't see the name of the person here, but someone on LinkedIn said fixed price implementation is a powerful position that improves early conversations and discovery. Have you seen a correlation between fixed bid contracts or fixed bid proposals and customer satisfaction, overall success?
Yeah. Well, fixed bid works in some scenarios, and the idea of fixed bid implies a box that, has very specific deliverables in scope. And so we see fixed bid implementation typically with mid-market, smaller enterprise clients, or implementations that are not necessarily a large scale rollout, right? So it's maybe a single module, et cetera. And fixed bid, what's really nice about that is that, number one, it really speeds up the selection process of, because, you don't have to map out a jillion requirements for implementation because there's like a set of menu delivered aspects to, you get this, if you go with this implementation fixed price to implement, solution X, Workday, Oracle, et cetera, right? And it's like, I've heard it referred to as like the launch methodology. And I even, heard one of the vendors that is saying for mid-market accounts, it's 45 to 60 day implementation. So, that sounds really good. And for some clients that have very minimal needs or are very small organizations, it does make sense. They don't need the big guns from, a management consulting perspective or process change because they're sort of starting with nothing anyways. And so in those vanilla cases, a fixed bid is really attractive. Where it loses appeal, though, is when the client needs a lot of process reengineering, change management within the organization. They're dealing with multiple silos of data and teams that need, I think, a more unified project plan and more hand-holding than a fixed bid implementation would provide. So in those cases, the promise of this fixed bid, sometimes it's it doesn't live up to delivering a good result from those implementation because it misses all of those really expensive things that are not included, like change management, like process reengineering, et cetera, that a larger scope project would potentially capture.
And what's even worse is they'll skip those things because they're out of scope typically for the fixed bid projects, and they skip them. And they can turn back and say, well, we delivered at a fixed cost a working technical product, but that's different than we delivered a technology product that's actually being used by the organization and operationalized and actually getting business value. Those are two totally different things. And so you have to be aware of what you're paying for, what you're asking for. Are you asking for the guaranteed fixed bid cost and that's what's most important to you? Or do you want to have other governance and guardrails in place to keep things on track, but yet be flexible as things evolve throughout a project?
Yeah, exactly. So what you don't want to do is like go with the route, which is like your mess for less, essentially, which is, taking a mess and creating it, just taking that mess and porting it into a new piece of software. I mean, it's really easy to turn the, flip a switch and get the data there. It's yet another to really think through, what needs to change in the process of moving systems as well. And I think that really is what you miss when you're doing a rapid implementation or an install that doesn't, account for some of those other things, Eric, that you just mentioned.
Yeah. This is from Colin on LinkedIn. Colin says, great conversation here, joining from Maryland. I've had mixed experience with systems integrators because of factors like inadequate requirements gathering, hidden costs, and rushed go lives. That's a really important point, and it actually ties to what you just said, Bonnie, around some of the risks and pitfalls of fixed bid contracts, is because now you've created a perverse incentive for the vendor to spend as little time and resources as possible on your project, because that's how they maximize their profit, is to do it as fast as possible and do it as cheaply as possible. That's going to ensure that they get that margin that they're looking for. But that's not necessarily the right answer for you as an organization. So I think it's fixed bid contracts to me are sort of not a fallacy, but it creates a false perception, a false sense of security that, I've totally mitigated risk now because I've gotten my system integrator to agree to a fixed bid cost. You haven't really, in my opinion, you haven't really changed the risk profile at all. You've just changed the risk, what types of risk you're dealing with. You just shifted it from one risk bucket to another. So you can't just assume that that's going to solve your problems, because it actually just creates new problems.
And if you go with this, cheapest quote, many times that vendor knows exactly that they're going to make up the difference in change orders down the road. And that's one of the things that we ask on every single one of our reviews is, was the project properly scoped, or did you have some change orders or significant change orders? And I will tell you that about 40%, so 4 out of 10 projects have some or significant change orders. Does the customer always blame the SI for that? And is there a rampant, bait and switch going on? Not necessarily. Some partners, I would say yes. However, it is a lot of times that the customer said, we got involved with the project and we thought we knew what we wanted. However, we had changes internally, our leadership changed. All of a sudden, we added something new to the project that we didn't have on the table previously. So, there's a level of, you're going to encounter, likely encounter some change orders. However, if you're going with an SI that has a track record of underscoping and, over change ordering, you're going to be able to see that in the data and the reviews from other clients. So look them up on ravenintel.com and you're going to see the worst offenders.
Yeah. Well, speaking of best and worst offenders, let's start with the best offenders. Based on your data, who are some of the consistent top performers in the system integrator and consulting world, and what is it that makes them stand out in your data sets?
Yeah. Well, there's some themes with top performers. Number one, in general, they are rating either a 9 or a 10 in satisfaction on every project. Does that mean that the client always rates the software vendor or the software project itself a 9 or 10? No. However, it means that they are rating the partner themselves and the consulting team that gets brought in either a 9 or a 10 on almost every single project, despite the challenges with it, right? So the top 10% of our SIs rate a 9.3 out of 10 average, as well as they have over 50 reviews, because they are consistently asking for feedback from their customers and are looking for that level of transparency and are very proud to put their clients in a position where they're giving public reviews on projects. That is a huge statement. When you have a client or an SI who is saying, we have delivered a high rate of customer success, how can you really prove that except with, the slides that the guys, in business development put up during the sales process? Well, it's easy to see those trends if they have public reviews, sort of like a restaurant out on Raven Intel, right? So the best firms are running to getting reviewed and are also consistently getting, high marks from clients as well. What are the traits? Governance first. So they bring in a strong PMO and clear escalation paths. So they're really good in the responsiveness category, and they're really good in the quality of consultants category. They're rating a 5 out of 5 or a 4.75 out of 5 in general. So governance first. Number 2, bringing in the right people and the right fit. 90% of projects that are staffed with experienced certified consultants from start to finish and who do not churn during the project life cycle are the happiest. The big issue we see is when the project team changes some or multiple times. So we ask the question, did your team change some of the time, many times, or did they stay intact? We can almost correlate to 1-to-1. When the team has significant turnover, I guarantee that overall satisfaction and success of the project is going to be low too. So you want to keep the team intact, and you want to go with somebody who has a track record of not, we're going to send in our A players for, months 1 through 3. And then all of a sudden we're going to swap them out with the offshore resources or, the JV team, once it's going to be too hard for you to disentangle yourself from us. So you do not want the churn on a project. You want to almost to a contract level say, this is the team that we were assigned. If there's a change on this team, you guys are paying us extra or something. Again, there's different ways to do that. And Eric, you have lots of great attorneys that you work with, helping with contractual agreements and things like that. But getting that team structure assigned in the contract itself or statement of work is a really big deal. And finally, they have change management embedded in the process. So not only are they looking to, flip on the light switch and get them live, but there is training and adoption planned in parallel with the build of the plan. So you want to make sure that that's accounted for in the course of the project. Those are always the project with change management, as part of an integral part of that project plan, is important. So the quote that I came up with for this area, leaders don't get you just live, they get you adopted. And in 2025, adoption is the real measure of success. It's not, did you switch systems? It's, well, is that system delivering the value you thought it would during the sales process? And those are the best. I can name some of them, just off the bat, people who are, or firms that are delivering like consistently well. Right? In the UKG ecosystem, we have H Architect, we have Cibility, we have RSM, we have Ascend, we have Hybridge. We have within the SAP ecosystem, we have folks like Rising and Jigsaw Cloud and Talent Team. We have other groups in one of the other ecosystems that we have as well. But those are like literally off the top of my head, where I can go down and look in the detail of what clients are saying and tell you without any hesitation, they're consistently delivering good work. And you want to find that partner who's a good fit for you, but also has the proof from customer results that what they're saying is true as well.
Yeah. It's crazy to me that you have to call out learning and adoption. Like you're saying that the top performers have learning and adoption embedded in their plan. And to me, my knee-jerk reaction to that was, why wouldn't you have that? Like, I'm shocked that are there a significant number of SIs that you see that maybe aren't scoring as high because they're not doing that sort of stuff?
Well, I think that, back to our conversation about fixed bid implementations, or, the implementations that are, whittled back to only include the must haves, right? Change management, is in there. Sometimes that's an easy one to cut because customers think, oh, we'll handle that on our side. We have good, change processes internally. We got that, and we don't have to spend a bulk of the implementation dollars on this, because it's not like a hard cost, so to speak.
Yeah.
And those are the ones, like the contracts that shortchange change management are the ones that really have some issues. Eric, the other area of training, it's not that they don't have it, but it's like a check the box sort of training. Like, oh, we have a help menu. That's training, right? I mean, or like we sent out recorded webinars on this. Like there's many degrees of training.
True. It might be training light, where, hey, we've got boilerplate generic training materials. We'll give them to you, Mr. or Mrs. Client. You go train your end users, and that's a lot easier said than done. And to your point about change management, I think a lot of companies think, how hard can it be? I mean, we're all excited for this new system. It's not going to be hard. But then, you get halfway through the project, you realize, oh, actually, it is very difficult, especially because these tools are so robust now that our jobs are going to be entirely disrupted with AI and other types of tools.
Yeah.
I'm here with Bonnie Tinder, and we're talking about some of the trends and the state of the union of system integrators across multiple platforms. We're going to continue the conversation, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. I want to invite you to join me and other thought leaders in the digital transformation space to Stratosphere 2025. It's an annual conference we've hosted now for 7 years in a row. It's a great event. It's live in Denver, Colorado, but we're also offering it virtually via hybrid tickets. And we're going to have a lot of different speakers here, including myself as a keynote, as well as others that you may know from the industry. And this is a perfect conference if you're interested in any sort of digital transformation, including ERP and CRM and HCM. And actually, the theme for this year's session is AI, and how AI is affecting all different types of digital transformation. But in addition to AI, we'll also talk about the fundamentals of digital transformation, including program management, evaluating the right software, digital strategy, change management, process improvement, all the things you need to know to make your project successful. It's also a great way to network and learn from others. So just being part of a community that is also like-minded and going through the same things you are, that's another value. And you can join, like I said, remotely, in person, and you can also buy VIP tickets if you'd like more exclusive access to me and others from the Third Stage team and other speakers that are going to be there. So I hope to see you soon. Check out my discount code below for discounted tickets. You can go to stratosphere2025.com for more information, including the full agenda, and I hope to see you there.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
With 1,000 lies and a good disguise, hit 'em right between the eyes, hit 'em right between the eyes. We knew I'd go away.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 235. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. This is the tech agnostic podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. And today we're talking about system integrators and what some of the data is showing about people's experience with working with system integrators. We're here with Bonnie Tinder having that exact conversation right now. Let's jump back into the conversation. This is a really long question. It's a 4-part question. So I'm going to try and summarize this. And this is from John Belden on LinkedIn. For those that don't know John, he's with a company called Upper Edge, and they help, part of what they do is they help clients negotiate with, so you know John. Yeah, if you don't know John, follow him on LinkedIn. Their company, he's a great guy, really well known in the space, and their company is as well. But his 4-part question is revolving largely around AI. So let me just try and condense this into a shorter question. But how do you see AI affecting the quality of people and deliverables? And, because in the past, if I back up, before AI, it mattered tremendously that you, Bonnie, are an expert in this system. You know how it works inside and out. That's why I'm hiring you, because you can come in and you can help do all the stuff that I can't internally. But now with AI, it's not that that's not important. It's just that now there's a tool that maybe takes some of that pressure off you being the sole expert, or my dependency on you maybe is a little bit lessened because of AI. How do you see AI affecting, how you evaluate or how we should be thinking about SIs going forward and their individual resources as well?
And here's where I see the voice of customer being so important. So what's the track record with other projects? And if you cannot find any other evidence of that would show the quality of consultants from other similar projects, then that's going to be a really tough one to verify. So John, how do you vet the fact that you're getting a really senior consultant on your project who has who really brings the expertise to the table and is not just some facade held up by a good generative AI who sounds good? I would say that's really where the importance of references, talking to other clients, looking up their reviews comes in, because other clients are going to sniff that out pretty quickly if they present really well during a meeting, and then when it comes to actually consulting, are not able to do the job. So I would say this is where you really have to vet your players, because right now anybody can look super credible with some of the polished video and the polished presentations that are possible. Even these startups that I'm seeing are like putting out content that looks amazing, and you think they're this huge company, when really it's just, a couple of kids who can, be masterful with AI and create this really professional looking stuff. And when you get down to it, it's like they had, 2 customers and they're still an MVP. So all of this to say, John, I think the idea of getting qualified references who are like you or like the customer, that will verify the fact that, the skill and the quality is legit is absolute paramount.
Yeah. Now, what about customer expectations around AI? I was reading an article a few weeks ago about, I think it was in the UK, and I might have mentioned this when I was on your podcast a few months ago, this same article, because it came out right around the time you had me on your podcast. But it was talking about how PwC in the UK, I believe it was, a lot of customers are demanding that they lower their fees because PwC is out there touting like, hey, we've got all these AI tools, we're totally changing consulting and the value to clients, blah, blah, blah. But then the customers weren't seeing any material changes to the effort and scope and cost and all that stuff. So they were basically coming back to PwC and saying, hey, if you're saving all this time and money for yourselves, you should be passing that on to us. So I'm just curious though, are customers outside that one article, that one use case, or that one example, are you generally seeing customers that voice a customer wanting more AI tools to make this a more efficient and streamlined and effective process with system integrators? Or is it more the system integrators are starting to push it to the customers?
I think that it's expected from customers that their AI, and that, you know, the SIs that they're looking at use AI in some way, right? But I think what they're more important about is how does that manifest within a project? How does that manifest to benefit me as the end customer? You know, what is it about it that's faster, cheaper, and more efficient than, you know, your competitor that I'm also looking at? You know, I think the term AI is like the equivalent of saying, oh, we use computers. Well, I mean, that's like pretty broad. How do you use AI, right? I mean, like, are your guys using, you know, Chat GPT to ask questions? And what does that mean? Right. So I think, you know, what's really on the shoulders of customers is to ask, well, what specifically are you going to bring with AI or provide me with in terms of tools that are going to, you know, that are relevant to this project? Because if all they're using AI to do is, you know, bill and record meetings, that's not really going to help me. I mean, recording meetings actually is pretty helpful sometimes, but you know, like it's like, give me some examples of where that is a change from what you've done in the past and why that makes you a better SI choice for me than the other guy that I've invited in as well. And I think you have to sort of define, what does AI mean? Because, like, again, it's a super vague term.
Right. Yeah. Makes total sense. Now, what about looking at red flags? What are some of the most common red flags you see in customer feedback that organizations should look out for before hiring a partner? You mentioned some of the risks of fixed bid. You talked about maybe underscoping or ignoring change management, training, enablement. What else? Are there other red flags that you commonly see in the data?
Yeah. So bait and switch staffing, we talked a little bit about this before, but that churn on a project team is really painful. So the senior, you know, varsity team comes in the beginning of the project, and then you got JV post contract. So you want to make sure that there are no signs of the project churn or significant project churn from an SI. And so back to, how do you guard against that? You know, get in your statement of work the team that is going to be assigned, and put, you know, repercussions that churns. The other aspect is a high rate of turnover within the organization. So ask, you know, what's your turnover rate with your consulting team in general? And what, and I've known this firsthand. So, you know, midpoint in my career, I worked for a consulting firm. So I knew how the game is played. When I first joined the organization, we were an A+ consulting firm. And for the first year that I was there, I mean, the talent on the team was amazing. At the time I was in marketing, it was easy. It was easy to get customer feedback and quotes and references and all of those things. I mean, we were in our glory days. Well, something happened. There was a leadership change, you know, and an acquisition that happened. And all of a sudden, in the course of 2 or 3 months, we had a mass exodus. And to the blind eye and some customer who was looking at this organization, they would have had no idea what was going on under the covers. But the A+ company became like a D- within the course of 3 months. And so the talent they bring to the table during the course of the project, you really want to, like, get a good feeling like these guys are in it for the long haul, and make sure that there isn't this high churn within the organization. Red flag is if, you know, the organization has had multiple acquisitions of other smaller players, and now they're bringing in all new talent, and you know, or they're two SIs that have merged together. there's going to be pain internally, and there's always fallout. Not that it's necessarily bad in general, but you need to make sure that there's not a lot of activity that is leading to this strife internally. The other thing with with churn is you want to make sure that the organization, the consultants have not only do they have good industry experience, but they've been with the organization for some time. It doesn't have to be 15 years. That you don't see that in consulting necessarily. On the other hand, you don't want, when you look up your consultant on LinkedIn, them to have 4 job changes in the last 6 years. So again, we're getting into people issues, but I guess consulting is people, right? So looking at some of these HR trends really relates to the team that you're going to get assigned. And so make sure there hasn't been that churn within the SI organization, because that will roll downhill and it will affect you.
Yeah. Yeah. And coming back to the whole red flag, top performer, low performer discussion here, I want to pop up this question again for those that didn't answer, but we'd love to hear from you what your general experience has been with system integrators, just in general. Has it been A, great, B, terrible, or C, mixed? Love to hear your feedback in the chat here. And while we're getting more responses to that question, Bonnie, what about cultural fit? When you talk about cultural fit between a client and the system integrator, is that something that shows up in your data? Does it affect overall project success? What do you think?
Yeah. And that term cultural fit, it's so vague, right? It's difficult to determine, and maybe a cultural fit is with your team one day, but all of a sudden the culture of your own organization has changed and now it's a mismatch. Or your leadership has changed, and so it feels like it's a mismatch. So culture is a tough one to really put a box around necessarily. However, what are some of the things that make a fit good feel good, right? It is about the team that is assembled from their side of things, and and that there are people on that team that you feel, hey, these guys could be an extension of our team. They operate like us. They have good, general skill, follow-up hygiene, right? They're responsive. You're going to see this demonstrated really well. How in the sales process are they showing that they are communicating that they understand our needs? If that isn't clear during the sales process, that ain't going to get better during the project. So, things like communication and how are they documenting even what they hear during the discovery process or selection process. That's like a really good leading indicator of what's going to be like. I would say that some of the best projects we see are the ones that actually name the consultant that worked on the project. And so the ones that have an actual person's name on them are usually rated a 9 or a 10, because they want that person to get recognized internally within their own SI organization as really been a champion for the client. So again, back to our people issues, it's, who is this team that you're putting in front of me? Not necessarily the brand, right? Because we see better success with some of these smaller independent firms than we do the big 6. By 2 points in implementation, right? So some of the smaller, SI firms are really providing such a better overall experience for clients than some of the big 6 are, in so many cases.
Yeah, very interesting. What about, has there been a shift toward industry-specific and verticalized solutions? So in other words, like the SIs that are focused on certain industries, certain functions, is that a trend, or are you seeing the opposite potentially?
I think single-threaded industry-specific SIs are, there's plenty of them there. I think they offer a great depth of knowledge. that some of the broader organizations can't, because their focus is so much on, let's say, healthcare or education, or public sector. And those are sort of like these industries that are, I don't want to say like the oddballs, but they are the oddballs, right? Because they're super complex in their own, and it really is helpful to have a strength and a focus on just those industries, to eat, sleep, breathe those industries. So I think the results with those specialty areas is really good. Where that falls down is sometimes all of a sudden they've been, you see an SI has been really successful in, one area, and then all of a sudden, oh, well, we're going to open up a new practice. And now we can also do retail. Well, that's where things get a little bit kludgy. With that said, I think there are organizations, if you can get an organization to provide you with very specific references by industry or geo, those are like sort of indicators in terms of what is the experience rate with somebody like me. So it's not enough to just get a reference from, if you're in retail and they're giving you a reference in manufacturing, let's say, you want another client who deals with, a retail workforce to provide that feedback, or, some of the ramifications of supply chain management, or, those sort of issues. If you're in manufacturing, that the retail guys are not necessarily going to know. So,
right. Now, what about misconceptions? What are the biggest misconceptions organizations still have about system integrators when you look at some of this data?
That because you recognize the name of a consulting firm, that they're going to do a good job.
Right.
I mean, that's the biggest one. They're big enough to advertise at the airport, or sponsor my vendors, rock band. So they must be able to deliver, right? Or they say they have 10,000, customers, and I recognize all these big logos. That's meaningless, right? All of those areas, all of those projects are potentially in a completely different area than you're looking at. And so I think that's the biggest misconception. Nobody got fired for choosing XYZ big SI firm. They may have not gotten fired necessarily, but they wasted a whole bunch of money and time and pain on projects that didn't go well either. So, that could have been a lot better with a vetted independent. So I would say that's a big one, is that just because they're a big name SI, and maybe they're the platinum sponsor of, the vendor's customer conference, that does not equate at all to customer success.
Yeah, you said something right there in passing that's super important, that bias that's introduced into the ecosystems by the vendors, because the vendors want the SI, not necessarily the SI who has the highest rating on Raven Intel. They want the SI that has the best track record of selling software and closing more business. So they're going to go to that platinum sponsor every time, because that platinum sponsor is presumably really good at selling, and that's how they became a platinum sponsor.
Well, and also the vendor is going to probably walk them in the door as well, which kills me, because that is not the right approach. On the other hand, I understand why, right? Those vendors rely on those big name SIs to sell a lot more software than the independents could. However, that doesn't necessarily equate to a happy delivery experience, or the right fit when your software vendor walks in the door. So if you are a customer and looking at the implementation, don't go with the firm just because your rep from your software vendor, introduced you. Make sure you're doing your own homework.
Yeah. And the irony of the whole nobody ever get fired for hiring insert big name here. The irony of it all is that, first of all, I can name a lot of people that have been fired for hiring one of those people. Second of all, of the ones that didn't get fired, some of them got sued
Yeah.
the vendor. But also, it's the other part of that is just that the big name is almost used as a CYA when things do hit the fan. So when things go poorly, you can say, well, I hired Accenture, I hired Deloitte, whatever. So what else could I have done? And it creates this sort of learned helplessness, where it's like, what was I supposed to do? I hired the big guys, so there's nothing, I couldn't have done anything any better than I did. And it kind of leads to this question that I want to get your thoughts to in addition to what I just said, Bonnie, but this is from Darian on LinkedIn. She says, how can clients vet churn risk before signing with an SI? And I actually might want to broaden that question a little bit and say, how do you manage these SIs, whether it's the resources they bring, the methodologies they use when it doesn't quite fit what it is you need, or, they're pushing on you to use standard off the shelf functionality, but that doesn't necessarily work for your business. How do you level the playing field more so you're not so dependent on the SI to take more of an outsourced approach and allow you to take more ownership of the project? What are some tips you have for us there?
Yeah. Well, I would say, the statement of work is a very important document because it defines the roles and responsibilities that contractually you are paying for with an SI. And so know what is in there and what is not in there, and make sure that it's not just you, if you're the executive, signing the contract, that knows exactly what those things are, but that every person on your project team reads those, what's in the SOW. Because sometimes the problem is not necessarily that the SI didn't define things well. It's the project team never really saw or understood the statement of work. So they were asking for things that weren't included. So I would say your statement of work is your operations guide. And if something isn't necessarily in there, how can I manage my SI? You want to know what can you manage, right? What can you control with the relationship? And your statement of work is contractually what you can control. So I would say number one, an understanding of that statement of work. Number two, you can't just throw the keys to your SI and, say, go ahead and, drive us somewhere. You have to be the passenger coach, navigating as well, right? So whoever gets assigned from your team needs to be as solid of a team leader as the team or the guys that you hire. So if you put a B player managing the project, you're going to get B results, right? Even if you hire the A player. So internally, you got to have your A team managing the project as well. You can't give it to, the folks who have time because they're not really proficient at their jobs. So, sometimes you got to line up your A resources internally at the same time as you got your A game with your SI going too. So that's the other way. And then, to the point of how do you manage churn, that specific question that was asked. Again, statement of work, getting the named consultants in there is really important. And so contractually, you can go back to your SI and say, hey, you told us this person wasn't going to change. So now you owe us something, or here's the repercussions of when it did happen unexpectedly that we want to hold you to. So all of this to say, I think making sure that you're lined up with the A team, everybody knows what the scope of the project is, not just your decision maker. And, contractually, you have the people's names within your contract will really ensure that things will go from a team perspective well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love the car analogy about how you wouldn't just hand the keys and say, take me to the beach without being more specific about, what kind of beach and where and how do you want to get there. I think you need to be, as the co-driver, you need to be a lot like my wife. She's very opinionated. She has a very strong vision of how I should be driving, which direction I should go, what speed I should go, whether I ride people's asses or not on the highway. She has very strong opinions about that stuff. And kidding aside, though, you kind of need to be that way for managing your SI. You don't want them just blindly guiding you down the path.
Well, and she needs to make sure that your kids are in the back of the car as well, not left at home. So a 1,000,000%, a lot of parallels there. She's also going to tell you where to park.
Exactly. And that I'm too close to the line and that I should do it over again. But this isn't marital therapy here. This is
right.
We're talking about this. I've lost track of what topic we're talking about here. So if you give one piece of advice to organizations selecting a technology implementer here in 2025, what would it be? What would that one takeaway be that you think is most important?
Trust but verify. So Do your homework on who you are getting lined up to guide you on your way. It's so important. But don't take what they are telling you at face value only, or don't just check one or two references. Really get behind the scenes in terms of asking the hard questions and getting the proof from other clients who have gone through it. Again, Raven is a free resource. You can do that. We can help you, vet partners as well if you're unsure, and give you some questions that you might use to get at some real answers. But trust but verify, and make sure that your statement of work really is that document that's going to line you up for the best success possible.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. I appreciate you being here today. And what a better closing comment than from Sam Graham on LinkedIn, who says, "This old dog learns new tricks every Tuesday." I do too. That's why I love doing these podcasts, because I learn from people like Bonnie, and that's why I have people on here that are smarter than me. And I appreciate you being here, Bonnie. This is great stuff. How can people tell us, remind us again how to get to your website? How do we connect with you? All that good stuff.
Absolutely. Ravenintel.com. I'm Bonnie at ravenintel.com as well, or Bonnie Tinder at ravenintel.com. So drop me a line, link in with me. Happy to talk all things implementation and partner success.
All right. Well, thank you, Bonnie. That was a great conversation and a lot to cover there, a lot to unpack, and some really good data points. Really interesting hearing about some of the impact that AI is having on system integrators and the overall effectiveness of system integrators. So we'll be curious to see how that affects overall time, cost, quality, satisfaction with system integrators over time as people get more acclimated with AI. So really interesting conversation there. And thank you for being here today, Bonnie. And thanks to the audience for the great questions. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have Clifford Martin on the show. And Clifford is our Executive Vice President of Third Stage Consulting in Africa. And he's going to be on the show to talk about a topic that is relevant across the world. It's not just for Africa or even for me here in North America. It's about wherever in the world you are, how do you select and manage the right system integrator or the best system integrator for your transformation? We're going to dive into that with him here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I met her in a club down in Old Soho, where you drink champagne and it tastes like Coca-Cola.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 235. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And you can also see past episodes of the show at that same website as well. So we just had Bonnie Tinder on the podcast to talk about some of the data she's seeing in her peer reviews of system integrators across different platforms. But I want to shift gears here now and talk more about from a process perspective. What are some of the best practices and processes and frameworks you can use to identify, to select, and manage the right system integrator? And if you'd like a supplementary piece of information or a supplementary ebook to go with this conversation, I highly encourage you to download our guide to selecting and managing the right system integrator. You can find that for free on our website. I'll include a QR code right here. You can also scan the links below to get to our website to where you can download that. But it's a guide that you can take with you, share with your team members to give you some criteria, some practical frameworks for how to select and manage a system integrator for your organization. But in the meantime, we want to have Clifford Martin on the show, or we actually had him on the show a couple of years ago to talk about this topic. And I want to replay the clip because it's a nice complementary counterpoint, not a counterpoint, but addition to what Bonnie was just talking about a few moments ago when we talked about some of the trends and patterns in the data that she's seeing in her reviews or the peer reviews that she's seeing on Raven Intel as it relates to system integrators. So now we want to shift gears and talk about, well, once you have those data points, now how do you go evaluate and pick the right system integrator? And then how do you ultimately manage that system integrator too, which is arguably even more important than selecting the right implementer. It's how do you manage them so they don't manage you, steamroll you, take advantage of an open checkbook, make decisions for you that they shouldn't be making because they're technologists, not business people. So all those sorts of things are the parameters that we want to talk about here with Clifford. So let's roll this interview where I talked with Clifford on this podcast about the same topic before, and we'll come back and talk about it.
Then a very quick intro for myself. I'm an ex-CIO. I left the corporate world probably 12, 13 years ago. I did have responsibility for multiple ERP implementations during that time. And post my career in the corporate world, spent a number of years with various consulting houses from Ernst & Young to KPMG to Gartner. And last year joined Third Stage, and it's been an exciting journey. So great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And glad to have you here today. And I think this will be a fun topic to talk about. It's a very timely and relevant topic. It's certainly relevant to most organizations that go through implementations, and we'll dive into that here in just a second. But I think you and I have a fairly unique perspective in that we both came from sort of the dark side, if you will. We both worked at the big system integrators. We know how they work. We know sort of the inner workings of what happens there. And so what I wanted to do is talk today about some of the challenges of managing your system integrator, how to hold them accountable, how to ensure your project is successful, which, by the way, a bit of a spoiler alert, your system integrator is not responsible for your success. Typically, you as the implementing organization are. So what is it you can do to ensure that you achieve that success? That's sort of what we'll talk about today. But before I jump into that, and I certainly, by the way, at any questions you have, please drop those in the chat as we're going here today. I've got a list of questions I want to ask, but I'd rather take audience questions. So I'll get us started, but any questions you all have, please feel free to chime in and drop them in the chat here, and we'll get to those questions. But I guess just to start, Clifford, throughout Africa, just like other parts of the world, and you're based in Africa, but I think you and I both have more of a global view of just how these sorts of projects and massive transformations work. But whether it's Africa or any other part of the world, there's a number of failures that are caused or can be directly linked back to a failure to provide oversight and management of the system integrator. What are some examples of those sorts of failure points, or maybe just help us unpack a little bit? What are some of the risks or challenges that are inherent in these sorts of relationships between organization and their system integrator that oftentimes leads to failure? What are some examples, or some of those higher priority examples that come to mind?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Eric. So I think, inherently, we're in an industry that is focused on, I think, primarily two things: selling software and installing software. And often the misalignment in expectations, I feel, between the industry that we operate in and the client's own expectations. And I deliberately use the word software installation. And perhaps I'm being a little bit harsh to their size, but essentially that is what they do. And I think often an organization is expecting a strategic partner, someone that's going to walk the full journey with them from, let's say, from business case to business benefit, and he's going to be them and guide them throughout that. And very often that's not the case. The primary focus of the SI is to deploy the software. And I think there's often that expectation gap and a failure on the part of the client then to properly manage the SI and ensure that they get out of the deal what they're expecting, and often what the marketing material has promised them. So perhaps to start, then perhaps let me just add a little caveat to that. You know, SI's playing an essential role. And I'm not kind of trying to diss them in any way. They do play an essential role. And certainly the ERP projects that have an SI on board are much more likely to be successful because they do bring structure and focus and a certain discipline and methodology. But once again, they do need to be managed. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not that people want their projects to fail, obviously, and it's not that they want the relationships to get sideways, but oftentimes they do. Why do you think that is? I mean, what are some of the, just in your experience, what are some of the root causes of why you think organizations struggle so much with that relationship and managing those system integrators, holding them accountable, and really extracting the value they bring to the table, but not letting it get out of hand or go off the rails? What are some of the reasons for that?
Yes, I think there are issues on both sides of the fence. And by that, I mean both in terms of how the manner in which the SI constructs and approaches the particular ERP or digital transformation project, as well as on the client side in terms of the capabilities that they require to ensure success. And very often, just a definition, a common understanding of what constitutes success, or for that matter, what constitutes failure, is not present, and there's no common agreement around that. Certainly nothing embedded into the contract that talks to success. So I do think there are failures on both sides, and as you correctly state, one can never outsource accountability for success. That has to reside with the client. I think we all know and accept that, but so often it's not the case. So often it's sometimes, I think, convenient for the client to kind of pass that buck to the SI and expect them to drive success. And then I think, Eric, what I find it to be extremely important is the whole contract negotiation, and what are we actually bringing the SI on board to do? Because SI contracts, and I've reviewed many of the tier 1 SI contracts, they're pretty standard. And I think the client needs to understand what the SI will not be doing. There are certain capabilities that, and we can unpack that in a bit more detail as we go through the conversation. But there's certain capabilities that they simply do not bring to the party. And standard SI contracts are primarily framed in technology terms, and the deliverables are framed in technology terms. Whereas very often what the client is trying to do is to achieve some business outcome, some improved operational experience, or bringing new business capabilities to the party, or enabling their strategic objectives, whatever the case may be. So there's this disjoint between the two, and I think if clients do not very forcefully ensure that the SI statement of work talks to what they're wanting out of the project, we already start off from a place where there are these misaligned expectations, and it's very difficult to bring that together thereafter.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there around the fact that technical deliverables aren't necessarily what organizations are trying to get out of these transformations at the end of the day. It's certainly a key part of the output. You need those deliverables, but there's a lot more to it than just delivering a system that works from a technical perspective. So I think that's sort of myopic focus that system integrators have, which is why you hire them, by the way. You hire them because they have that depth of knowledge. They know the software really well, whatever software it is you're deploying. But it's the other stuff outside the technology that ultimately makes the project successful, whether it's the process improvement or the change management, the architecture and data migration, the overall program management. And that's typically stuff that the system integrators don't bring to the table. It also seems like that a lot of times, tell me if you agree with this or if you have thoughts on this, but it seems like also there's a sort of two other dynamics at play when organizations are managing their system integrators. First of all, the organizations typically aren't experts in whatever sort of deployment you're doing or any sort of digital transformation, which is why they've hired the system integrators. So there's on one hand, you can understand why you hire the system integrators. They're there to sort of fill the competency gap that you don't have internally. But that lack of knowledge and that lack of experience can lead to sort of a blind management of the system integrator, which can be challenging. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a dynamic you've seen as well?
Yeah, such a good point, Eric. And my first action point is, if I engage a new client, is to have some type of executive boot camp. Because we kind of assume that the executive understands what a typical transformation or ERP journey looks like. What are some of the critical phases and deliverables, some of the critical decisions that they will be called upon to make throughout this journey. And they don't, and it's probably unfair to expect them to do that. And if you look at the average ERP or digital steering committee, we kind of take the different managers of the different business domains or lines of business and kind of bundle them together into a steering committee and expect them to oversee and drive success. And I think that's unreasonable. So one has to ensure that the executive is educated on their oversight role. And let me also say that, how we define these ERP transformational journeys, the default from their side is going to be to define it as primarily a software installation or a technology project at the very least. And I think the executive's role is to take a full life cycle perspective on this and look beyond. Deployment of the solution is not success. It's, as you correctly say, it's an enabler. So we now have the enabling technology in place, but exactly how we're going to leverage that in support of the business objectives is something that the executive need to play in long after the SIs popped the champagne cork, declared victory, and moved on to the next project. So I think executive education and ensuring that they stay in the game is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you need to know, it's not that you or I would suggest that an organization needs to become an expert in digital transformation before they embark on one, because that doesn't make sense and that's not realistic. But you need to educate yourself enough to know, at least enough to know what kind of questions to ask, how to push back or challenge assumptions that SIs might have. They've got their cookie cutter boilerplate approach that may or may not fit with your needs. And ultimately, it's up to you to say, hey, these parts of your methodology or your approach works, but here's what we think we need to do to modify to fit our situation. And that could be, cultural nuances. If you're a risk adverse organization, for example, and you just move slowly as an organization, you can't just come in and force fit a fast deployment. You've got to sort of right size it for your organization, just as one example. So I think just knowing enough about these implementations, being self-aware to know how we can kind of meld these two competencies together, our own internal competencies with the system integrators. I think that's a big, an important point as well.
Yeah. And perhaps I can add to that in terms of if we're talking about capabilities within the client organization. One often finds vendor management to be quite poor, or at least not at a mature level where they can effectively manage the SI and hold them to account. And just having that kind of level of professional skepticism, you talk about pushback, absolutely. Because we do know that the SI part of the agenda is going to be to drive additional revenue, often through change requests or customizations or additional functionality. So having that professional skepticism to push back and ask, is this really necessary? Is this within the scope? What are the implications of this? Is it priority? Can we do it post-deployment? Is extremely important. And then the vendor management, I think is, and let me add to that as well, a third capability, program management, especially when there are multiple SIs involved or multiple projects within a broader program. It's so important that the client organization has a mature program management capability, typical a PMO office, in order to pull that all together and orchestrate it and drive the integration and ensure that there's at least a common approach, common methodologies towards a common integrated goal. So I would say those three capabilities: the executive know-how, and oversight, the vendor management capability to kind of manage the SI, and then the program management capability from a delivery perspective to pull this all together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Just before we keep going with the questions here, just to give you a quick overview of where people are joining from today, I'd ask the question to open up, where are you joining? And I ask people to drop that in the chat. Just a few examples here. We have someone here from Florida State University in Florida. We've got someone from North Carolina. We have someone joining on LinkedIn from South Carolina in the United States, Columbus, Ohio in the United States, as well as an international audience, as I mentioned too. We've got someone here from Toronto, someone joining from the UK, Brooklyn, New York, which is not international, at least where I'm at, but still a global audience, and someone from Kuwait and India, just as a few examples of where people are joining from today. So thanks everyone for joining and letting us know where you're at today, and whichever platform you're watching on. Again, feel free to drop any questions you have for Clifford or I as it relates to this topic, and we'll get to those here in just a moment. So some of the issues you've just talked about, Clifford, why do you think they're so prevalent, not just in Africa where you're at, not just in the United States where I'm at, but throughout the world? Why is this such a global challenge? It doesn't seem to be something that's just, pockets of the world are struggling with it. It seems to be a pretty global problem. So why is that? What would you say the root causes are?
Yes, Eric, yeah, it's interesting. It is prevalent, and I find it very interesting that the same issues that we're discussing now, if we were having this discussion 5 or 10 years ago, we'd probably cover a lot of the same ground. Yeah. So these things seem to be perpetuated. But nevertheless, we need to also understand that SIs have tremendously powerful marketing machines. They come with a very strong, experienced team. They have a very slick approach in terms of engaging and embedding themselves within organizations. And I don't mean this as an affront to SIs. SIs will do what SIs do. I think it's incumbent upon the client to manage that, as with any vendor or partner, or with any type of project within the organization. So I do find it both frustrating and interesting that it seems to be very similar issues, that the technology changes, but the issues tend to stay the same. And I do think that, if we just take contract negotiation as one example, you have a tier one vendor with a big team often sitting in the background of technical people, attorneys, legal input, senior partners negotiating, and you have some poor guy in procurement who's probably never done this before in his life representing the client organization. It's an absolute total mismatch, So somehow these issues do seem to continue. Exactly what the answer is, I don't know. But I do think that, given in the last few years we've had a number of high public, certainly in this part of the world, failures with in the ERP, in the transformation space. It's public knowledge. It's been in the public space. Some of the big tier one consulting houses have been involved. So I certainly think that organizations are kind of waking up to the fact that they have to take control of these projects. They have to be a lot more skeptical. They have to interrogate things in a lot more detail, and manage it a lot closer. So whilst I say that the issues seem to continue at the same time, and let's face it, I think what one also sees is that organizations appointing third parties to provide some independent program assurance and advice on an ongoing basis and assist them in this space. So whilst things stay the same, there is some positive news, and I think there is some positive things happening in terms of better managing SIs.
Yeah, it's a good point. I agree with you, by the way. I think I'd take your point even further, which if you go back 20 plus years, back to when I started my career in the space, it was largely the same. You had the same dynamic, the same challenge, and some of the same root causes that that organizations struggle with in that management of their vendors. And I think the key, one of the key takeaways that I always leave clients with, or encourage the market in general to think about this is, view it as your project. You're almost like think of yourself as sort of the general contractor building a house. You've got subcontractors and different experts that you're bringing to the table, but ultimately you need someone as a general contractor to manage those resources. Your system integrator is one important component, but you might have other people that are helping with change management or data migration, or your internal resources, of course, are critical to the project. So you just need sort of that global program management view and that sense of ownership, that sense of empowerment that, hey, this is my project and I'm going to make decisions. I'm going to take input. I'm going to listen to my advisors or to my system integrator. But at the end of the day, this is my project, my business, and I've got to do what's best for my business. And I don't think enough organizations have that confidence or that mindset. I think a lot of them just think, for a lot of the reasons we've discussed, they just think, hey, I'm going to outsource this to my system integrator. They're the experts. I don't know enough about this. I don't have time to deal with this. So therefore, I'm going to sort of outsource this and abdicate responsibility to the system integrator. So I think it's a really good point, a series of points that you make there.
Yes. And I think, Eric, continuing on that conversation topic, what one has seen, in my view, is that we have at least seen a shift from IT departments or IT organizations within the enterprise managing, almost solely and exclusively managing these projects, to a greater involvement from the business side. And, to the extent where business managers and super users and subject matter experts are seconded almost on a full-time basis to the projects and play quite a significant role as a significant stakeholder group, and as they should. So I do think that's positive, because it ensures that it brings more of a business slant to it and at least positions the organization to better achieve the business objectives of the project.
Right.
So I think that's a positive move. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'd be curious to hear from the audience here, especially because we have people from so many different countries, if these are some of the dynamics you've seen, or if you've seen some different dynamics potentially in your part of the world. And speaking of that, we have a couple other guests that have joined that have also indicated where they're from. Deborah, who's a connection of mine on LinkedIn, says bonjour from Paris, France. I don't know if it's too early in the day to say bonsoir yet. I'm not sure what time of day you switch from bonjour to bonsoir. I always get confused on that, but either way, hello there in France. And we also have Abdul from Pakistan joining as well. So thanks everyone for being here. So when you think about some of the larger system integrators, and you and I both come from an environment or from one of the bigger system integrators, what are some of the unique challenges of dealing with a larger system integrator that organizations should be aware of, like a Deloitte or Accenture or a KPMG, whoever it may be?
Yes, I think it's always a question as to what model does one adopt. Is it a multi-vendor model? Do we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and give it all to one large SI, and then pretty much be fully dependent on that SI? So there are different models at the opposite end of the spectrum. I have seen some organizations quite successfully cherry pick the best independent contractors out of the market and utilize that. That's an exception. So I think that is an important question at the outset of the transformational journey or ERP project. But I personally do favor a bit of a mixed model. I think and certainly I do favor building a very mature capability in the organization to be able to manage these different vendors. But one's always going to have a lead SI. I think that is important. And it does sometimes make sense. I mean, we go back to our earlier point, there's certain capabilities that the SI does not bring. So you have a choice as to whether to plug that gap yourself as the client, or to bring in some independent players. And the typical areas are data cleansing and migration, training, user acceptance testing, change management, post-go-live support. There's often a kind of hypercare period for 2 to 4 weeks where the SI stays on board before they try and kind of hand you over to their outsource arrangement. So I think there are pros and cons. And one thing that I think is absolutely essential in terms of managing the large SIs, Eric, is that one has to have some type of predefined quality criteria linked to the deliverables, clearly defined in the statement of work, and preferably linked to the billing schedule, so that it's not just a time and material driven contract or fixed price contract, but there's some incentive for them to ensure that they deliver to a predefined and documented level of quality and completeness, whether that's testing or design or data migration or customization, whatever the case may be. And certainly the standard SI, tier 1 SI contracts are not going to come with these. They are not going to give you the ammunition by which to manage them, or the tools by which to manage them more effectively. You need to, as the client, ensure that you embed that in the contract up front. And then it's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier. I do find that the tier 2 vendors are more open to negotiation. They're more flexible in terms of their standard contract T's and C's and statements of work. But certainly at the tier 1 level, I think it's quite a tough negotiation process to get those types of clauses embedded in the contract so that you can better manage that SI.
Yeah, agreed. I'm here with Clifford Martin. We're talking about how to select and manage the right system integrator for your organization. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I don't mind letting you down easy, but just give it time.
I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent, technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation. And you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 235. My name is Eric Kimberling, and we're here talking about system integrators, how to select and manage the right system integrator for your organization. And just as a reminder, if you'd like to learn more about this topic, be sure to download and read our guide to selecting and managing the right system integrator. You can do that with the QR code on the screen here, or you can go to the link below. And in the meantime, we'll jump back into the conversation here with Clifford to talk about how to select and manage the best system integrator for your organization. You know, with the big system integrators, it seems as though there's so much money at stake for these system integrators when they have these bigger projects. If they've got 10, 20, 50, however many full-time equivalents on a project, that's a big revenue stream for them. And so one thing I noticed when I was at one of the system integrators is we would spend an inordinate amount of time just figuring out how could we not only keep those 10, 20, or 50 resources on the project, but how could we add a few more? How could we get some more people embedded in the project? And there's also a sense of sort of a curtain, like don't look behind the curtain. Like if I'm the project lead or if I'm the partner at one of the system integrators, I remember being at the system integrator, there was sort of an imaginary curtain there that's like you'd have the lead face of the team that would go deal with the client, but everything we were doing behind the scenes, there was almost like an intentional arm's length distance, so the client didn't have the visibility to see why there were so many people on the project, what were we doing, who's holding us accountable. And so it's a conflicting interest. There's a conflict of interest there because the system integrator is trying to maximize their revenue. You're just trying to make your transformation successful at the optimal cost, and those two things are in direct conflict. So is that a dynamic you've seen, or do you have any suggestions on how to navigate that?
Sure. And if I may just divert to the questions, there's a great question I've just noticed from, I'm not sure if it's Hassan Kabara, talking about how to manage that SI, and specifically the example that I mentioned is post-go live. And the point being made is that very often there are only, the issues only surface a couple of months after go live. And I think it comes back to your point, Eric, and the issue we were talking about earlier around how do we manage the SI in terms of ensuring the quality of their deliverables and the quality of solution that they deliver at the end of the day. And I tend to advise clients to steer away from and talking in the post-go live space now, to steer away from time-driven measures, i.e. we will provide 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 weeks support, and move towards quality-driven metrics. We will be on board until you have executed all your critical business processes, until a critical mass of your end users have logged onto the system and are able to access and perform their duties, until you have executed all your significant business cycles, whether that be the budgeting cycle or performance management cycle or year end or month end, whatever the case may be. So I think and of course it's too late then, when you do pick up issues, because probably if you hadn't read the fine print in the contract, through the process of user acceptance testing, you've adopted the solution, and to a large extent, you've diluted your ability for remedial action, for recourse, and going back to the SI and saying, hold on, there's some issues over here which emanate from the project. So I think it's so important that we have those quality metrics throughout the different phases, as well as post-go-live, and that we hold the SI to account to ensure that the solution is within a reasonable time stabilized in the business, and that the organization starts to leverage, and it at least is on a trajectory towards achieving the original stated benefits which gave rise to the project. So to me, it does come back very much to ensuring that the statement of work and the contract is properly structured so that you can hold the SI to account for their deliverables.
Right. Yeah, and even just within that too, just taking a more active hands-on role to know, what are these different work streams, different tasks and deliverables that different team members from the SI are working on. And, being a part of that, because I think, again, a lot of times organizations take sort of an outsource mentality or a delegation mentality where system integrator is going to do it for X amount of time and money, and I'm not going to worry about how it gets done or how the sausage gets made. But you should worry about how the sausage is made, because it's your business. I mean, you're the one that's going to be living with this for years or decades to come. So you need to make sure you're involved in that.
Sure.
What about this? Here's a question that's somewhat similar, and this is from Sam Graham. Hello, Sam. Good to see you again. Sam is a regular attendee for a lot of these live streams we do, and a great participant. He always has really good questions. But the question is, you've mentioned training, but do companies need ERP education as well so they can understand and challenge the SI's advice and decisions? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. And it comes back to our earlier discussion about executive bootcamp, and not just at the executive level, but absolutely, Eric, and thank you for that question. And it kind of, to me, starts with how do we define this journey? Because if we're going to allow the industry or the SI to define it, it's going to be pretty much defined as a technology project with success achieved at the point of deployment of the solution. And of course, we all know that's not the end of the project. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's perhaps the end of the beginning, in terms of that all your work still lies ahead of you in terms of deriving business benefit. And there's no good reason to implement an ERP, in my view anyway, even a technical upgrade, unless it's going to achieve some business benefit, or as a minimum, remediate some risk within the organization. So I do think that defining what this project looks like, what is that life cycle, and the role that the executive needs to play over the full life cycle is fundamentally important. So in a nutshell, absolutely, it is unreasonable to throw a hodgepodge of executives together and expect them to successfully play a meaningful role in over the full life cycle of the project. I think it's unreasonable without some education.
Right. What about, and this sort of relates to this whole education concept and a lot of the things we've been talking about so far, but what about bias? How does bias from the system integrators, how does that affect a project in terms of, certainly by this point, by the time you've deployed or employed a system integrator, you already know what the technology is you're deploying, but it seems as though there's biases in how technology gets deployed, and there's biases in how much of that technology you should or shouldn't use that can be in conflict with the best interests of the organization that's actually implementing. So what are your thoughts? How does bias fit into all these challenges we're talking about?
Yeah, I think clients are often naive, and perhaps not unexpectedly. We need to recognize that there is some relationship between the solution providers and the partners who implement them. So the Oracles, Microsofts, SAPs of the world, and the tier one SIs. So, and the question is always, what do we do first? Do we find the solution ourselves and then bring the SI on board? Do we use the SI to find the solution, and then possibly deploy them as a partner on the journey? So, and there are pros and cons, and to all those different approaches. But certainly, one has to, I kind of like this term, professional skepticism. One needs a high dosage of that when dealing with SIs. And once again, SIs do what SIs do. But we do need, and from the beginning right through to the end of the project, because let's face it, they are going to try and generate additional revenue. And in most cases, the senior partners and directors on that project are personally incentivized to generate additional revenue. And there's certain ways they're going to do that. I often find that, in one, I like to think it's an extreme example. I had an example where where the senior partner for a tier one vendor actually chaired the client's change advisory board, i.e. the forum through which all change requests came through for increasing the scope of the project. Now, that's a clear conflict of interest. One cannot have that. Because with the best will in the world, you cannot expect that individual to be making objective decisions around your business, your money, and to what extent you increase the scope with the requisite implications on the budget, the quality, and the timeline of the project. So I do think it comes back to ensuring that there's very clearly defined roles, and that in terms of the decision-making that resides and is retained within the organization, we cannot give that up to the SI, because it is unfair to expect them to make decisions in our interest as a client when they are subject to all these other pressures back in their own organization to grow the account.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just from a services perspective either. I mean, that's probably the bigger, more immediate risk that you have, is that the SI is trying to grow their account, grow their revenue stream from the services side. But then there's also this bias on call it the product or the technology side, where it's sort of like you're kind of going in with blinders. If you're implementing SAP, for example, I'm thinking SAP first for everything, which may be the answer most of the time, but there may be parts of your business where we should not be using SAP or whatever ERP system for that. We should be looking for a third-party bolt-on, or maybe we should be creating a custom solution. I mean, that's not the end of the world if we do something like that. But your system integrator is going to push you toward that product in all instances, or in most instances. So I think that's a lot of organizations face too. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think, Eric, it comes down to the request for proposal and the RFP, and understanding what your requirements are. And I've seen some organizations, and I think it's actually a good tactic, is to have a specialist company come in that is not an SI and assist them in formulating the RFP, or at least running business process workshops and requirements gathering sessions with their end users to better understand exactly what are the current pain points, what are the future requirements, what's the strategic intent of the business, what new capabilities do they require, is it a tier one solution, is it a tier two solution, what's the best deployment method, is it on-premise, is it SaaS, and what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different solutions out there. And I quite like that approach, because then one gets to perhaps not a detailed blueprint, but a fairly low level of detail in terms of understanding what are our current requirements or what are our future requirements and how big are the gaps, and having that separate. And of course, if one does that correctly, it does then reduce as a positive impact on the cost structure for bringing an SI on board, because a lot of the design work is already done. And one can then continue that. It becomes reusable and repeatable throughout the life cycle. So one way of dealing with that bias that you refer to, I think, is to firstly understand extremely well what you're wanting out of the solution, exactly what you're wanting it to do. And number two, having that exercise independent from both the SI and the solution provider.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you've hit on another thread here as far as, how to counter what's the antidote to some of the challenges we're talking about. We've talked about the education and how to, educate yourself so that you can at least know enough to ask the right questions and challenge assumptions. The other is to take ownership that we've talked about. And then, you've talked about a couple other things here as it relates to managing that relationship and really ensuring that you're not being biased in that process, and having that. The third thing you bring up, or the third thread, is just sort of that clarity of vision, that clarity of what we want to be when we grow up. The better you understand that, the less likely you are to fall into these traps where, if you don't have a clear vision of what you want to be when you grow up, now all of a sudden the power dynamic is shifted. Now you've become even more dependent on the system integrator. They're taking even more control, more ownership of the project, when really what you should be doing is tilting that back towards you and taking that control. And I also, by the way, really like that term you used, professional skepticism. I always tend to use the word buzzkill, but I like professional skepticism better, because that's a more positive or professional variation of that as well.
Yes.
I wanted to just bring up a really interesting point here, just to, if anything, to validate, Clifford, that you and I are not the only ones that are have this sort of jaded view of system integrators from having been there. But this is from Louise on LinkedIn. She says that she's really enjoying the discussion. One of the reasons I left an SI and became an independent consulting was just such conflicts of interest as I became more senior in my career. So that's exactly why I left the big system integrator too. There's something about it didn't feel right, and there was other reasons too. But that conflict of interest and that feeling of extreme bias and not necessarily doing what was in the client's best interest it just didn't sit well with me, and so it for that reason I ended up moving on. So I'm glad we share that same sentiment. This is a little bit different question, but really important one, building on a point you made earlier, Clifford, about how to have the right statement of work and the contract and setting expectations up front. Along those same lines, though, the question from Abdul on YouTube is, what kind of KPIs should a company be looking for during or post implementation of an SAP project? And actually, I think this question to any sort of ERP project, whether it's SAP or any other system. Can you kindly share your views on that? What are your thoughts?
Great question. And Eric, it's such an important topic, and it's this whole issue of benefits realization. And companies start off with very lofty and noble ideals encapsulated in their business cases and program charters and so on. And very quickly that gets left behind, and we're all kind of in the trenches, stuck in this ERP project now, just trying to survive and make the go live date. So I certainly advise clients that in parallel to the project rollout, we have a benefits realization work stream that starts with taking the business case, the stated benefits or the envisaged benefits in the business case, unpacking that in more detail, baselining that against the current company metrics. As an example, if we're pursuing operational excellence, which is often a very important role and kind of fairly standard objective of an ERP. I don't think you should ever be implementing an ERP if you're at least not going to drive some best practices and operational excellence and improved operational performance. So there's certain key metrics, and of course, a lot of the tier one ERPs these days come with those tools. On the SAP side, something like value lifecycle management, they're embedded and part of the ERP solution. But I don't think clients are aware of them enough, and certainly don't use them enough. So I do think the benefits realization needs to be a separate stream. It needs to be owned, and of course one can get external assistance. It needs to be owned by the organization. It needs to drive a lot of the decisions we're making. If we're looking to land new capabilities, let's use e-commerce as an example of a recent client. That's one of the reasons to enable new business capabilities within the organization of your ERP platform, then that needs to form a key part of the design. Now, you spoke about the cookie cutter approach earlier. We cannot then have the SI coming in and having a uniform standard approach when we are well aware that in a particular area of the business, we're wanting to really get a mature capability in place. We've got to then kind of focus the design around that, the testing around that, the user training around that, and that's got to inform and drive the project lifecycle. So if we don't have this benefits realization program, and we don't understand what we're trying to get out of the system and ensure that we scope and approach the different phases of the rollout or implementation with that in mind, then we lose sight of those benefits realizations, and unsurprisingly, we never achieve them. So the whole area of having a parallel benefits realization work stream, utilizing the tools that are available to inform and drive those benefits out during the project and post-go-live, I think is fundamentally important.
Yeah, great point. It ties back to your point about that clarity of a vision of what you want to get out of the system. What do we, first of all, what do you want this transformation to be? What's the intent? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the sort of the high level parameters and guardrails? Having those clear expectations and understandings, as well as the metrics that support that. It's just another arrow in your quiver to give you more ownership and more control and more accountability of the project as well.
Yes.
Just a quick comment here from Paramore, which is a really cool name. I may be mispronouncing it, but I like that name a lot. I totally agree with Clifford. So I'm not sure which part she agrees with, but maybe it's just in general. But at least someone listening here today agrees with you and I here in the discussion. And then Kyler, who's our co-host of this show, of this podcast, pointed out that we have a new buzzword alert. And if you listen to the Transformation Ground Control podcast often, which if you don't, I encourage you to, I don't want to say we make fun of buzzwords, but we have a good time with buzzword alerts on that show. So you helped us create another one. So thank you, Clifford, with that professional skepticism, which I'm going to steal that idea, by the way. So I guess we've talked a lot about some of these bigger system integrators, and that was sort of the last thread that I had asked you about, Clifford. But what about smaller SIs? And you started to talk a little bit about this, about how some of the tier 2 system integrators may be lesser known. They don't have the brand name recognition. You don't see their billboards at airports, or they're not sponsoring golf tournaments. So you may not know them as well, but there's some really good ones out there that can be more flexible, more willing to negotiate. What are some of the pros and cons of working with someone other than one of the big tier 2 system integrators?
Yes. So I think with the tier 2 system integrators, they don't generally have the breadth and depth of skills that a tier 1 would bring, and especially if, as happens, there's some churn and turnover of resources on projects, they're not necessarily able to instantaneously replace them with a similar level of skill. So that is a risk. I do also think that sometimes their implementation methodologies are not as robust or comprehensive, and certainly I'll give credit where it's due. The tier 1 SIs have a well-tuned, comprehensive and robust implementation methodology, whether they borrow that from the solution providers, an Activate or a SureStep, or in the case of SAP and Microsoft as examples, or whether they have their own. They're generally quite similar, but they bring that to the party. And I do believe that governance is such an important aspect in terms of being successful in this area, having effective governance. And so one does find that the implementation methodologies are a little bit lighter, perhaps a bit weaker. They don't necessarily have all the trackers and templates and tools that come with the tier 1s, and the one therefore has to augment that yourself. And that, of course, implies that you do need to, as the client, then if you are using a tier 2 SI or multiple tier 2 SIs, you do need a stronger program management office. You need to be kind of the glue that brings it all together and that drives the quality and the standards, and is able to augment, whether it be on tools, methodologies, resources, skills, as and when required, and possibly play a bigger role, I would say. But perhaps that's not a bad thing. Perhaps, I do feel sometimes that drives greater ownership and involvement on the side of the client as well, because there isn't somebody, standing there saying, very happy to take control of your project and help you spend your money. So, yeah.
Yeah. What I've seen too is some of these tier 2 system integrators, and I agree with everything you just said, by the way, as far as some of the strengths and weaknesses. But another one I'd add is that a lot of times with the tier 2 system integrators, you're getting more senior people, because a lot of people start off their careers, like you and I, earlier in our careers, worked at one of the big system integrators. But at some point, oftentimes, people get burned out, sort of mid-career and move somewhere else. And a lot of times they go to a smaller tier system integrator just because it's a better fit, it's less stressful, and for other reasons. Have you seen that as well?
Yes, absolutely. I do think one has, you have the attention of the executive. And of course, it's often a bigger account for them, relatively speaking, than it would be for a tier 1 SI. Therefore, that you do kind of get more attention and quicker response to issues. So, I do agree with that.
Great. There's a question I had here. I want to come back to. Where was it? Oh, here it is. First of all, a comment here from Louise, strong governance and PMO. She strongly agrees with those points. And I think regardless of what type of system integrator you use, whether it's a big one, small one, tier two, having that program management in place is really important. And then here's another question from Sam Graham again on LinkedIn, which is a really interesting one and a good question, as always, with Sam. Is it true that many very large organizations are actually an amalgam of smaller business units, and so tier two systems can sometimes be an option? So in other words, if you're a big company, but on paper you look like maybe you should be deploying an SAP or an Oracle, but really you're just a bunch of smaller business units that combine to create a big overall business, that might be that a tier two system or multiple tier two systems might be the better answer. Is that something you've seen as well?
Sure. I think the question is always with those types of organizations to tier or not to tier. And do we have a model that once is offered is in terms of the transactional commoditized type business processes, the back office, generic business processes, HR, payroll, procurement, supply chain, etc. One has some type of shared service model, and that might be on a tier one solution because some of them are pretty good at that. That's where they come from. And then in terms of agility and the more unique or even customer-facing components of the organization, there's a tier two solution in place, and possibly even multiple tier two solutions from different solution providers or vendors. So certainly, I do think that's a critical question. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all for the entire organization, where you do have a central head office with multiple branches or multiple subsidiaries and divisions, and especially when they're in different demographics or countries, time zones, etc. So it's a good question, and I think one should always consider that for those types of organizations.
Right. Now, what about this question? Here's a question from YouTube, and I'm actually going to broaden the question a little bit from the original intent, but hopefully it'll still cover what you're looking for here, Abdul. But the question is, do you have any general advice on implementing AI technology with system integrators? What should we focus on? And maybe instead of just AI, maybe I'll talk about, why don't we talk about just bleeding edge or emerging technologies, new stuff like AI, robotic, process automation, machine learning. A lot of times these system integrators and software vendors are really pushing some of these newer emerging technologies, which may or may not make sense for where you are as an organization in your journey. And you really have to look at, how big of a jump is that? Are we ready to make that leap now? Should it be in the first phase? Maybe it's a later phase that we deploy it. How would you suggest that an organization navigate some of those decisions around newer, more robust, emerging technologies with the system integrator? How do you suggest they handle that?
Yes, and I think, Eric, perhaps to start in terms of responding to that question, as you correctly say, the tier one vendors, these days it's about the digital platform, not just kind of the ERP back office system, and they do or claim to have these new emerging technologies, whether it's machine learning or AI, IoT, whatever the case may be. And and to a large extent that is true, but they are still maturing solutions, and they're not necessarily fully matured in the marketplace yet. So certainly those types of solutions are gaining traction and are being deployed and effectively deployed. But I think the client organization needs to ask themselves, as you alluded to, are they ready for this? Do we have a digital savvy executive? Do we have that type of innovative culture that's going to be able to exploit these types of technologies? And very importantly, have we bedded down the basic foundation and our transactional backbone within the organization, because we cannot innovate off an unstable foundation. And too often, I think organizations want to take this leap and are pushed by the market and certainly by the solution providers and the SIs to move into that emerging digital technology space, but they have not yet bedded down that core foundation that allows them to just be in the game, not necessarily to win in their markets, but at least to play the game. And I think it's fundamentally important that we get that part of the organization stabilized and that there's a very specific use case and business case for engaging any SIs or deploying any of these so-called emerging technologies.
Yeah, and some of these emerging technologies, especially if you look at AI, which is what the specific question was focused on. You look at something like an AI, which really threatens, in many ways, it threatens the status quo. It threatens employees' jobs, because you're potentially automating what someone was manually doing or decision making that someone was making in the past. So the technology itself may be the right fit, or it could be a good strategic enabler for your organization longer term. But shorter term, you've got a real change management issue, which when you look at some of these emerging technologies, I would argue that change management becomes even more important than it already was, which was already very important. But now it's even more important because you're disrupting the status quo even more than you already were. So I guess it kind of leads me to another question, just more of a general question, is what are some of the missing competencies that system integrators don't necessarily have, or they don't do well, even if they tell you they do? What are some of those competencies that are oftentimes lacking, but yet those competencies are going to be critical to the success of your project? So we need to be aware of them and figure out how we're going to plug those gaps. What are some thoughts that come to mind there?
Yes, I think that there's some very basic ones, which one almost never sees an SI take responsibility for. So in the data ETL or extraction transformation load area, that is often something that is absent from an SI agreement. Certainly training, SIs like to use this train the trainer approach. I don't think it's particularly effective.
Agreed.
And there are a number of ones, but Eric, the one that always kind of trips clients up and is user acceptance testing. And one often finds that that the contracts are structured in a way that the SI is accountable for the integration testing. So let's say 2 or 3 integration test cycles leading up to user acceptance testing. But that's a critical handover point. And clients fail to organize properly for it and properly interrogate the system and recognize that you are now taking on the solution. And your job as a client now is to assess whether the solution's been built in accordance with the design that you gave the SI in the blueprinting or design phase. And clients fail to recognize that they need to organize themselves accordingly to fulfill what is an extremely important role, because beyond that point, you kind of lose your right to recourse. It's a bit late, and specifically post-go live. So being able to build capability to, at critical junctures or intervals in the project, step in and say, does this make sense? Am I happy with this? And then step out and hand that back to the SI and say, yes, we're kind of happy with this. You can now go ahead and deploy the solution. Or even, let me use a typical example. I sit on a number of client steering committees for ERP projects, and very often, and it's quite concerning, go live or deployment decisions are made in one of 2 ways. The SI walks into the meeting, to the final steering committee meeting, where we're going to approve or make the decision whether to go live or not, and says we're ready to go live, and the executive kind of looks at their toes and everybody nods in agreement, and it's a 5-minute meeting and we go live, and often the issues. Or the SI walks into the steering committee meeting and says we're ready to go live, and there's a whole debate about the extent to which we're ready to go live, and is there proper evidence available? What are the key criteria? Is the evidence to support it? Have we met all the necessary competencies, business readiness and training and all those good things in place? And there's a debate about it and a distinct lack of evidence to support any decision. So I think that's just an example of where organizations need to ensure that they are able to build capability to properly interrogate these decisions and make informed decisions on their project and the extent to which they are ready to move from one phase to the next, or sign off on deliverables, or deploy the solution, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, really good point. And it's it's another important milestone in the project that is really, really important for organizations and their internal project teams to take ownership of. So in other words, it's only you that should be deciding whether or not you're ready to move past this user acceptance testing into ultimately the training and go live that happens after that. And a lot of times organizations defer too much to the software vendors, or the system integrators, I should say. And ultimately, you really do have to say, are we ready? How confident do we feel? it's amazing to me, we do a lot of expert witness work, which is, for those that don't know, it's expert witness work is when you're supporting a lawsuit. So there's a lawsuit that involves an ERP implementation. Typically, a system integrator and or software vendor gets sued because something goes wrong. And in those failures that we see in these expert witness cases, it always fascinates me how often you hear this dynamic of the organization saying, well, the system integrator told us that everything was fine. They told us that the status was green, across the board. Maybe there's a couple of yellows, but nothing major. But yet we went live and it was a total disaster. So you can't, that's unacceptable. You can't let that happen. And you have to know, and back to our opening comments about educating yourself and knowing enough to challenge and ask questions and challenge assumptions. You have to know enough to know whether or not the status is really green. If it's red and someone's telling you it's green, you should know enough to know that that's not a green status. Things are not going well, or we're not ready, or here's the risk that we need to mitigate. And that's a big challenge that a lot of organizations face with these system integrators.
Professional skepticism.
But yeah, professional skepticism. Yes, be a skeptic and be pleasantly surprised if you're being overly skeptic. It's very rare, though, that I see organizations be too skeptical. Typically, they're too optimistic, or they believe too much, and you really have to be you have to challenge it in many ways. So I guess just to wrap it up, I feel like we could talk easily another hour about this topic, maybe even more. But maybe just to wrap it up, what is sort of a capstone question here. What sort of closing advice would you leave for an organization that's about to embark on a digital transformation? Maybe they're in the process of managing a system integrator, or they're trying to figure out what system integrator is the best fit for them. What are just some general, high priority, what are those highest priority summarizations of best practices as far as managing your system integrator and just setting yourself up for better success?
Yeah. So very quickly, Erica, given that we're at the end of the session, so, I think one has to own the project, and I know that's a bit of a buzzword, but you have to actually own it and understand what you're wanting out of it. I think one has to ensure that you you manage that and you negotiate an appropriate contract, and that you understand exactly what the SI is doing and what they're not doing, and therefore what you need to take responsibility for. I think having the organizational structure in place, it stays the client's project, and we haven't kind of even touched on things like the typical pairing model that SIs bring to the party, where they create two parallel project structures and never shall they meet, with the SI project team reporting to the SI and everybody else kind of reporting to the SI as well. So, it's so important in terms of how you structure the project, the types of roles, the stakeholder engagement, the people you bring on board, the oversight, and then what do you define as success going forward, and what constitutes success, and having a common uniformed view amongst the executive and key stakeholders as to what constitutes success. And perhaps the last point I would make is it makes sense to use a third party. Have someone in an assurance and advice role. The cost of such a role is generally negligible in terms of the overall capital cost of the project, and set up and embedded in the contract up front, set up some type of quality metrics with regular stage gates and check-ins at critical intervals in the project timeline, to have someone independent assess, are we on track? Are we happy with these deliverables? And kind of keep the SI honest, if you want. So 4 or 5 key areas, but I do think it makes sense to ensure that you do get independent advice and ongoing support throughout the project lifecycle. And if you have the capabilities in place to do that, fine. But if not, I think it's very important that one has that in place.
So a great conversation from this podcast a couple of years ago. It's one of those timeless topics that never really gets old, and it certainly stands the test of time. Some of the things we talked about there with Clifford. So appreciate him sharing his insights, and curious to hear your thoughts on what your experience has been with selecting and managing system integrators, what you think to be the most important criteria to consider, et cetera. So that's what we've got for you here today. We covered a lot as it relates to system integrators and selecting and managing those system integrators. Look forward to seeing you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.